She thought she was just restoring an abandoned military jeep until turning the key unlocked more than an engine. In its glove box, a letter long hidden carried the voice of a soldier lost 50 years ago. That abandoned military jeep became a bridge between generations, a vessel for courage, sacrifice, and a brother's last wish. What began as a quiet restoration turned into a mission to honor a hero and keep his story alive. Stay with us. This emotional, true story of an abandoned military jeep will touch your heart and prove that some engines never really stop running. Before we dive in, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode is truly mind-blowing. Let's get started. If you'd wandered into the mountain town of Pine Hollow on a winter afternoon, you might have missed her entirely. Tucked away at the very edge of Main Street, behind a weathered cedar fence and an old mailbox that leaned to one side, was a small workshop that smelled of oil, pine, and coffee. It belonged to Claire Whitmore, a 32-year-old mechanic who had more patience for broken machines than most folks had for each other. Her place wasn't fancy, a corrugated metal roof that sang in the rain, walls lined with dented toolboxes and mismatched shelves, each one holding the kind of treasures only a mechanic could love: old carburetors, coffee cans full of bolts, and stacks of dusty manuals. Claire had grown up in Pine Hollow, the daughter of a logger who taught her to listen to the language of engines before she could even read. She was the kind of person who could tell you the year of a truck just by the sound of its idle, and who still believed that every machine had a story if you were willing to hear it. That's why, when a neighbor mentioned some old army jeep rotting away in the woods, she didn't hear junk. She heard a mystery. The jeep, they said, had been there for nearly half a century, an old military transport from the early 1940s, left to sink into the forest floor after its last mission. No one remembered who owned it now. No one had touched it. The winters had eaten at its paint. Moss had crept across its fenders, and the steering wheel was as brittle as bone. But Claire, she couldn't get it out of her mind. There was something about the idea of a vehicle that had once carried soldiers, stories, and maybe even hope, now sitting silent under the weight of 50 years of snow and rain. And so, one frost-bitten Saturday morning, with a thermos of black coffee in one hand and a crowbar in the other, Claire stepped into the woods to find it. She didn't know yet that what she was about to uncover wasn't just metal and rust. It was history. It was loss. And it was a story that had been waiting 50 years for someone to turn the key. The snow crunched under Claire's boots as she made her way along the narrow deer trail. The forest around Pine Hollow was silent that morning, save for the occasional caw of a raven overhead and the whisper of wind through the tall pines. Her breath hung in the air like smoke, each exhale a small puff of determination. The neighbor's directions had been vague. Just keep walking past the old sawmill, hang a right where the creek bends, and you'll see it. Claire had been half expecting it to be a wild goose chase, but when she reached the bend in the frozen creek, something green, or what was left of green, peeked through the snow. There it was. The military jeep sat hunched in the undergrowth, like an old soldier in retirement. Its once proud olive-drab paint faded into a dull, patchy brown. Thick moss blanketed the hood. Icicles clung to the bumper, and the tires had long since surrendered to the earth, half swallowed by mud and roots. The windshield was cracked, its glass clouded with frost and dust. Claire stopped a few feet away, feeling a strange pull in her chest. She had worked on dozens of old vehicles before, but this was different. The Jeep wasn't just abandoned, it felt forgotten. There was an air about it, as if it had been waiting. She brushed the snow off the hood with her gloved hand, revealing faint, white, stenciled numbers, army barely visible beneath decades of grime. Her fingers traced the letters as if she might coax the memories back into the metal. "What have you seen?" she whispered to the machine. Inside. The seats were nothing but rusted springs and scraps of cracked leather. A bird's nest filled the glove compartment. The steering wheel's thin rim flaked away under her touch, and the gearshift was frozen stiff. But when she leaned in, the faint, familiar scent of oil and metal still lingered, like the heartbeat of something that refused to die completely. She pulled out her phone, snapped a few photos, and sent them to her friend at the Pine Hollow Historical Society. Within minutes, the reply came. "Claire, I think that's a 1943 Willys MB. These were used in World War II. Where did you find it?" A 1943 Willys, a piece of history. Her heart thudded in her chest. But then came the second message. "If that's the one I think it is, you should know. It might have belonged to Captain Joseph Halloway. He never made it home." Claire stared at the phone, her fingers tingling. She didn't know much about Joseph Halloway, but she had heard the name in passing an old Pine Hollow story about a young officer who'd shipped out in 1945 and never returned. Some said his Jeep had been shipped back, but no one knew what had become of it. Until now, the weight of it all pressed down on her. This wasn't just an old military Jeep to fix up and drive around town. This was a relic, tied to someone's life and possibly someone's last moments. She crouched beside the Jeep, studying the frozen metal as though it might speak to her. She imagined it roaring down muddy European roads, soldiers laughing in the back, the smell of fuel and gunpowder in the air. She imagined Captain Halloway gripping that steering wheel, eyes scanning the horizon. And then she imagined the silence after, the decades of rain, snow, and falling leaves. Claire's breath clouded in front of her. "All right, old friend," she murmured. "Let's get you home." It took hours to clear the brush and dig the wheels out of the frozen soil. Her crowbar and shovel clanged against metal that groaned in protest. She wrapped chains around the Jeep's frame and hooked them to her pickup, the sound of the winch echoing through the trees. Slowly, inch by inch, the Jeep emerged from its 50-year grave. By the time she got it loaded onto the flatbed, the winter sun had dipped behind the mountains, painting the snow pink and gold. Claire stood with her hands on her hips, sweat cooling on her back despite the freezing air. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was carrying more than just steel and rust back to her shop. She was bringing home a story, and in her gut, she knew that when she finally turned the key, she'd be unlocking something far greater than an engine. The garage smelled of kerosene, old leather, and the sharp tang of steel. The 1943 Willys MB sat in the middle of the concrete floor like an honored guest who had seen better days, its body riddled with rust, its bolts frozen solid from decades of neglect. Outside, Pine Hollow was wrapped in winter silence. But inside Claire's shop, the air was alive with the hiss of a space heater and the clink of tools. Claire worked slowly at first, almost reverently. She'd begun by stripping away the moss and debris, brushing every inch with care. Each time her wire brush scraped over a panel, the Jeep revealed more of its faded olive paint, the stenciled letters becoming clearer, the metal sighing as if relieved to finally be seen again. There was something about working on this Jeep that felt different from the muscle cars and farm trucks she'd restored before. Those jobs were about performance, horsepower, aesthetics. This was about bringing a piece of someone's life back into the light. She began with the easy tasks, unbolting the rusted hood, removing what was left of the seats, emptying the glove compartment of twigs and dried leaves. That's when she noticed the saddlebags. They were strapped to the rear of the Jeep, the leather cracked and brittle, the buckles coated in a thin crust of orange rust. She hesitated before touching them, half afraid the straps would disintegrate at her fingertips. With the gentleness of someone handling something sacred, she unfastened the first buckle. It gave way with a reluctant snap. Inside, she found nothing but dust and an old canteen with the initials J. Ch scratched into its side. Her heart skipped. Joseph Halloway. She set it aside carefully, her hands trembling just a little. The second saddlebag was harder to open. The leather resisted, as if it had decided long ago to keep its contents hidden from the world. She coaxed the buckle open, wincing at the sound of tearing leather. Something was inside. She reached in, and her fingers brushed paper dry, fragile, and folded. She pulled it out slowly, revealing an envelope yellowed with age. The paper crackled in her hands. On the front, in faded black ink, was written, "To my brother, Samuel, if this reaches you, I'm already gone." Claire's breath caught. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she sat back on her heels, staring at the envelope as if it might vanish if she looked away. She could almost feel the weight of the years pressing down on it, the unspoken words trapped inside for 5 decades. She thought of Captain Halloway, a man she'd never met, but who had once stood where she stood now, hands on this same metal, eyes scanning the same dials and gauges. What had he been through in those final days? And why had this letter never reached Samuel? The space heater hummed in the background, a steady reminder that she was in the here and now, even as her mind drifted back to some cold night in 1945, when this Jeep had been alive with the sound of its engine and the rattle of gear. She placed the envelope gently on her workbench, away from the grease and grit, and kept going. She removed the steering column, carefully freeing it from decades of rust, then tackled the transmission, noting how each bolt fought her before finally giving way. Every part she removed revealed more: a scuffed military map folded beneath the passenger seat, a spent shell casing lodged in the corner of the floorboard, a dog tag tangled in a nest of old wiring. By the time she called it a night, the Jeep looked like a skeleton, its body panel stacked neatly against the wall, the frame bare and waiting. But in that stripped-down state, Claire felt like she knew it better. She could see the battle scars, the dents and scrapes that told of hard miles and harder days. She wiped her hands on a rag and turned to the envelope again. The shop was quiet now, the heater's hum the only sound. She picked it up, feeling the brittle edges between her fingers. She didn't open it, not yet. That felt like a moment that needed the right time, the right frame of mind. But she knew this much: restoring the Jeep was no longer just about fixing a machine. It was about delivering a message left unsent for 50 years. And deep down, she had a feeling that once the engine roared back to life, so would the story of the man who had once driven it. The next morning, the snow in Pine Hollow lay thick and untouched, like a blank page waiting for a story. Claire stood at her kitchen counter, a steaming mug of coffee warming her hands, the envelope from the saddlebag lying in the center of the table. She'd barely slept every time she closed her eyes. She saw that faded handwriting, heard the phantom growl of the Jeep's engine in her mind. She thought about opening it right then and there, but something held her back. This letter had waited 50 years. It deserved more than a hasty read between sips of coffee. It needed to be opened when she could give it her full attention, and maybe when she knew enough about its sender to truly understand it. By mid-morning, she was at the Pine Hollow Historical Society, the envelope safely tucked in her coat pocket. The small building smelled faintly of old paper and cedar, its walls lined with black and white photos of miners, loggers, and soldiers who had once called the town home. Behind the desk sat Marjorie Klein, the society's unofficial historian and a walking encyclopedia of local lore. "Marjorie," Claire began, pulling out her phone to show the photos of the Jeep and the artifacts she'd found. "I think I've found something important." Marjorie adjusted her glasses, peered at the screen, and let out a low whistle. "Well, that's Joseph Halloway's Jeep, isn't it? We thought it was gone for good." Claire set the envelope on the desk. It was in the saddlebag, addressed to his brother. Marjorie's expression softened, her voice dropping. Joseph was a good man. Born and raised right here, shipped out in 43, served in France and Germany. Word came back in 45 that he didn't survive. His brother Samuel, he never spoke much about it. But I know he took it hard. They spent the next hour combing through the society's archives. Claire learned that Captain Halloway had been just 26 when he died. The photos showed a tall man with kind eyes, one arm draped around a fellow soldier in one snapshot, leaning against the very same Jeep in another. There was even a faded map with Pine Hollow circled in pencil, perhaps marking the trip he'd hoped to make home. Seeing his face, seeing him alive, shifted something in Claire. Up until now, the restoration had been about machinery bolts, gaskets, and grease. Now, it felt like she'd been entrusted with something far more precious, the memory of a man who had once lived, laughed, and dreamed of returning here. When she returned to her shop that afternoon, she looked at the stripped-down frame of the Jeep with fresh eyes. Every dent wasn't just damage. It was a mark of service. The faded paint wasn't decay. It was the last whisper of a uniform once proud. She ran her hand along the chassis, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll get you back to how he knew you. I promise." The restoration took on a new rhythm. Claire found herself working longer hours, the cold seeping into her bones but not into her resolve. She sanded each panel until the original olive drab began to peek through, careful not to erase the imperfections that told its story. She ordered period-correct parts from collectors halfway across the country, refusing to cut corners. One evening, as she cleaned the dash, she noticed something she'd missed before tiny initials carved into the metal just above the glove box, J.H. It stopped her cold. She traced them with a fingertip, imagining Joseph's hands doing the same decades ago, perhaps as a quiet act of ownership or comfort. By the end of the week, the engine, long silent, was ready for its first test. Claire had rebuilt it from the ground up, every piston, gasket, and bearing meticulously replaced or restored. She turned the key, and for a moment, there was nothing. Then, with a cough and a deep rumble, the engine came to life. The sound filled the shop, echoing off the metal walls. Claire's throat tightened. It wasn't just noise, it was like the Jeep itself was waking up, stretching after a long, cold sleep. She stood there, hand on the hood, eyes closed. In that moment, the distance between her and Captain Halloway's time seemed to vanish. She wasn't just fixing a Jeep. She was bringing back a piece of history for a man who never got the chance to see home again. And though she still hadn't opened the envelope, she knew this much when she did. It would be with the Jeep restored, alive again, as if both letter and machine were meant to return to the world together. 3 days after the Jeep's engine first roared back to life, Claire was tightening the last bolts on the rear axle when she heard the crunch of tires outside her shop. She looked up, expecting it to be the mail truck or maybe one of the regulars coming by to check on her progress. Instead, A dark green pickup pulled into the driveway, its body speckled with road salt and mud from the back roads leading into Pine Hollow. A tall man in his early 60s stepped out. He wore a weathered bomber jacket, his gray hair tucked under a wool cap, and his eyes, a pale, piercing blue, scanned the workshop like he was looking for something long lost. "You Claire Whitmore?" he asked, his voice low but steady. "That's me," she replied, wiping her hands on a rag. "Can I help you?" He took a deep breath, almost as if he was bracing himself. "Name's Samuel Halloway." The name hit her like a jolt. She'd seen it on the envelope so many times in the last week that it felt almost mythical, like a name out of a novel. But here he was, flesh and blood, standing in the doorway of her shop. "You'd better come in," Claire said, motioning him toward the workbench. She gestured to a folding chair and poured him a cup of coffee from the thermos she kept on hand. Samuel's eyes landed on the Jeep in the center of the shop. For a moment, he didn't speak. He just walked slowly around it, his fingers brushing the metal, pausing on the initials carved above the glove box. His jaw tightened. "This was my brother's." "I know," Claire said softly. "I found it out in the woods. Took some doing to get it here. I've been restoring it piece by piece." His gaze shifted to her, studying her face like he was trying to understand why a stranger would care enough to do something like this. Why? She shrugged lightly. Because it mattered to someone. Because it's a story worth saving. They sat for a while as she told him everything she'd learned about the moss-covered hood, the rusted saddlebags, the dog tag, and finally, the envelope. At the mention of it, Samuel's eyes widened. "You found a letter?" Claire reached into the top drawer of her workbench and pulled it out. The paper was still brittle, the ink still faded, but the words on the front were as clear as the day she'd found them. "To my brother. Samuel, if this reaches you, I'm already gone." His hands trembled slightly as he took it from her. For a long moment, he didn't open it. He just stared at the handwriting, running his thumb along the crease like it was some kind of tether to the past. I thought, whatever he had to say died with him, Samuel said quietly. Claire waited in silence. She knew the letter would be opened when he was ready, not before. When Samuel finally looked up, his voice had shifted, gaining a kind of quiet determination. "You said you're fixing it to run again." "That's the plan. I want to help," he said simply. And so, over the next several days, Samuel became a regular presence in the shop. Though his hands were stiff with age, he was meticulous sanding panels, cleaning old bolts, and telling Claire stories about Joseph as they worked. Stories she'd never read in any archive the time Joseph drove the Jeep through a flooded creek to rescue a farmer's family, or how he'd once patched a tire with strips of his own shirt just to keep moving. As they worked, the Jeep began to look less like a relic and more like a soldier ready for service again. New tires replaced the rotted ones. The paint was carefully matched to the original olive drab, and every detail down to the smallest decal was restored with precision. One afternoon, as they tightened the last bolt on the driver's seat, Samuel looked at the Jeep and then at Claire. "When it's done," he said slowly, "I want to drive it to the memorial in town. I want my brother's Jeep to stand where people can remember him. It was more than just a plan, it was a purpose." Claire felt it settle in her chest like a promise. The restoration was no longer just about honoring the past. It was about sharing it with the world. She nodded. "Then we'll make sure it's ready for that day." The days that followed felt different. Before Samuel showed up, the restoration had been a quiet, solitary thing. Claire had always liked it that way. The hum of the heater, the steady rhythm of her tools, the satisfying click when a stubborn bolt finally gave. But now, the shop was filled with something else: conversation, laughter, sometimes long silences that weren't awkward but heavy with shared thought. Samuel didn't move fast age, and a lifetime of hard work had left his knees stiff and his grip slower than it once was, but what he lacked in speed, he made up for in precision. He had the patience to scrub a single piece of chrome for 20 minutes until it gleamed, or to line up the tiniest decal exactly where it belonged, using only his eye. And he told stories. At first, they came out in fragments, short memories, a detail here and there, but soon they stretched longer, richer. Claire learned that Joseph had been the kind of man who would give away his last cigarette to a nervous recruit, who could fix a broken axle with scrap metal and baling wire, and who had once driven this very Jeep straight into a hail of fire to get his men to safety. There was a quiet pride in Samuel's voice when he spoke about his brother. But there was pain there, too, the kind of pain that had settled deep and old. Claire noticed the way he sometimes paused mid-sentence, his eyes going distant, as if he was back in 1945 hearing the news for the first time. Working beside him, Claire began to see the restoration in a new light. It wasn't just about replacing parts or matching paint. It was about respect. It was about treating every scratch and dent as part of a man's legacy. And in the process, she felt something changing in herself. Claire had grown up the kind of person who didn't dwell on the past. Her father had been a mechanic, her mother a school teacher, and when both passed away within 2 years of each other, she'd thrown herself into work to avoid the quiet. She'd built her life around engines and repairs because machines were simple if something broke. You could take it apart and put it back together. People weren't like that. But Samuel was teaching her that sometimes the past isn't a weight to carry, it's a story to preserve. That some things, like his brother's Jeep, are worth holding on to not because they're perfect, but because of what they've endured. Late one evening, as snow fell softly outside, they stood together looking at the Jeep under the shop's bright lights. The body gleamed in fresh olive drab, the stenciled numbers restored, the canvas top neatly fitted. It wasn't finished, there were still details to add, minor tweaks to make, but it already looked ready to roll out into the world. Samuel broke the silence. You know, for 50 years, I thought that chapter of my life was closed, that nothing could bring him back. He rested a hand on the hood. But seeing this, hearing that engine, it's like I can feel him here again. Claire swallowed hard. Maybe that's what this is about. Not just fixing what's broken, but bringing back what mattered. Samuel nodded, his eyes glistening. And you've done that, Claire, more than you know. That night, after Samuel left, Claire lingered in the shop. She walked slowly around the Jeep, running her fingertips along the smooth paint, the restored grille, the curve of the fenders. She thought about how much had changed since she first found it, buried in snow and moss. She thought about the unopened envelope still tucked away in her desk, and how, soon, its time would come. For the first time in years, she felt like she was working toward something bigger than herself. This wasn't just a job. It was a promise. The Jeep had been built for service. Joseph had lived for it. And now, through her hands and Samuel's stories, it would serve again not in battle, but in memory. And as she switched off the shop lights, she realized something else. The restoration wasn't just transforming the Jeep. It was restoring something in her, too. The morning of the memorial dawned crisp and clear, the kind of early spring day when Pine Hollow seemed to hold its breath. Snow still clung to the mountain peaks in the distance, but the valley was waking up patches of grass pushing through, the river running faster with the melt. Claire was already at the shop before sunrise, pacing like a commander before a mission. The Jeep sat ready, gleaming in its fresh coat of olive drab. The chrome shone, the tires were clean, and every stenciled number looked like it had just rolled out of the factory in 1943. The engine, rebuilt from the ground up, waited patiently for its cue. Samuel arrived just after 7, wearing a neatly pressed wool coat and a military cap that had clearly been stored with care. He moved slower than usual, but his posture was straight, almost formal. "She's ready," Claire said, her voice quiet but full of pride. Samuel nodded once, then looked at her with something between gratitude and disbelief. "I never thought I'd see this day." They climbed into the Jeep, Samuel in the passenger seat, Claire at the wheel, and with a deep breath, she turned the key. The engine rumbled to life, that deep, steady growl filling the shop. Samuel's hand rested on the dash, fingers brushing the carved initials J. The drive into town was slow, deliberate. As they rolled down Main Street, people turned to watch. Some waved, others simply stood in silence. Veterans in caps nodded solemnly as the Jeep passed, as if saluting not just the machine, but the man who had once driven it. The town square was already filling with people when they arrived. A small platform had been set up near the war memorial, a granite pillar etched with the names of local men who had served, Joseph Halloway among them. Flags fluttered gently in the breeze. Claire parked the Jeep in front of the memorial, the crowd parting to make way. Samuel stepped out slowly, his hand resting on the side of the vehicle as if it were an old friend. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the envelope. The murmurs in the crowd quieted. Samuel took a long breath before speaking. "For 50 years, I didn't know this existed. My brother wrote it during the war. He never came home to deliver it himself." His voice wavered, but he steadied it. "Today, I'd like to share his words with you." He unfolded the fragile paper with care, the breeze tugging gently at the edges. His voice, when he read, was soft but carried clearly across the square. "Dear Samuel, if this reaches you, I won't be there to say these things in person. Don't let my Jeep rust away somewhere she's carried more than just me. She's carried hope and brothers who needed it most. Keep her running, and remember that service isn't just about war. It's about taking care of people. And Samuel, take care of home. That's what matters most. Your brother, Joseph." By the time he finished, there were tears in more eyes than just his. Claire stood off to the side, her own throat tight, feeling the weight and beauty of the moment. Samuel folded the letter and slipped it back into his pocket. "I think," he said, turning to Claire, "we've done right by him." The crowd began to applaud, not the raucous kind, but the slow, steady rhythm that felt like respect. Veterans stepped forward to run their hands over the Jeep, whispering their own memories of similar machines. Children leaned in to look at the dials and switches, eyes wide with curiosity. For the rest of the afternoon, the Jeep sat at the heart of the square, its story shared over and over. People spoke of Joseph Halloway not as just a name on a stone, but as a man who lived, served, and left behind something worth preserving. As the sun began to set, painting the mountains gold, Claire and Samuel stood together by the Jeep. Neither spoke for a long time. Then Samuel said quietly, "The sky was never the limit for Joseph. And now, thanks to you, neither is his memory." Claire smiled, her hands resting on the warm metal. She realized then that the restoration had never really been about the Jeep at all. It was about connection between brothers, between generations, between past and present. And as the last light faded, she knew one thing for certain: some engines, once restarted, Never truly stop running. Anyone can bring history back to life if they're willing to care enough and work long enough. As the last light faded over Pine Hollow, Claire Whitmore stood beside the restored military jeep, its engine still warm from the day's journey to the memorial. She reached into her workbench, not for another tool, but for a fresh notebook to sketch out a plan for helping other veterans and families preserve the stories they thought were lost. She understood now this restoration had never just been hers. It belonged to every soldier whose name had faded from memory, every family with an untold story, and every person who had ever been told that the past was gone forever. The mechanic who once worked alone in a quiet mountain town had become the keeper of a legacy that would carry others forward. Because for Claire, and for those who follow, the end of a journey is never the end of the story. It's only the beginning. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories waiting for you. Click to keep traveling through history with us, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe stories are worth saving.